Hi, everyone. Welcome to Smarter Lending, the essential podcast for environmental, construction, and appraisal due diligence insights. My name is Liz Mahoney. As your host and the Director of Sales and Business Development at Lender Consulting Services, I bring 15 years of national lending expertise to the table. Join us as we engage with industry experts to demystify due diligence, reveal insider knowledge, and stay ahead of the trends. Whether you're in the trenches or new to the field, tune in for Smarter Lending Strategies. Let's dive in. Welcome to today's episode, Building Smarter, the Onset of Construction Due Diligence, where we explore the critical world of due diligence in construction projects and SBA lending. Joining us are three distinguished experts, Michelle Walters, also known as the SBA Loan gal, with a decade of unparalleled experience in aiding entrepreneurs through various SBA lending processes. Nick Jellam, president of Jellam Law, PA, renowned for his advisory on commercial loan transactions, and an active voice in financial and banking circles. And Michelle Alabiso, senior project manager and director of construction operations at Lender Consulting Services. Together, they will dissect the complexities of new construction versus renovation, unveil the common pitfalls in SBA lending, and underscore the importance of meticulous due diligence in averting legal and financial crises. Listen as they recount real-life horror stories and provide crucial red flags and guidance to maintain legal compliance and financial health in construction projects. Stay tuned as we navigate through the intricate maze of construction lending, offering expert insights to guide lenders and borrowers toward the successful completion of their projects on time and within budget. Well, hello, everyone. Let's dive right in. Michelle, can you kick things off by explaining how the due diligence process differs for new construction versus renovation?
Yeah, I think new construction is very different from renovations. With new construction, there's more work in regards to site selection, site preparation, permits, weather delays. You're building something from ground up, right? Versus with renovation, you've got existing walls, existing foundations. You don't know what's behind those things, and so it's very different from new construction. No construction is the same. That's what you need to understand about renovation and new construction projects. Nothing's ever the same. It's important to ensure that the contractor has the right qualification and experiences for each specific project. And really, on new build, due diligence often includes the plan and specification cost review, which is going to include draw monitoring. Renovation is going to include basically both and the plan and cost review. But those are part of the two due diligence tools that we use to kind of make sure that everything gets done right.
Thanks, Michelle. Nick, can you describe a common pitfall in construction due diligence for SBA lenders?
Sure. So I think there's, quite a few pitfalls, regardless of whether or not it's SBA or conventional lending that is funding the construction. Of course, with SBA, we have to understand what the specific SBA requirements are as it relates to bonding and insurance and other types of issues that really nowadays follow kind of prudent best practices. So that's a good thing. But of course, we still have to understand what are common pitfalls. And from my vantage point, at least from the legal side, the most common pitfalls that we see are just lack of understanding, especially by borrowers who may never have gone through a construction project, may never have obtained commercial financing, certainly may never have obtained SBA financing. So when you think about all of those different complexities that are brand new experiences, a lot of times with due diligence, we get into it with the lender. And unfortunately, along the way, we find out that the borrower just didn't know what they didn't know, right? So I think certainly a good litmus test is to have that discussion with the borrower as to what their experience has been previously, and then to make sure they really do understand what the due diligence is that will be necessary from a lender point of view.
That makes a lot of sense. That leads me to ask, how does the lack of due diligence impact the legal aspects of SBA lending?
Oh gosh. I mean, it can impact everything from just the timing and the flow of the transaction. So that's usually the first thing that we see is that the closing of the loan and the starting of the project become delayed. And nobody likes delays. Borrowers don't like delays. Contractors don't like delays. Lenders don't like delays. Believe it or not, attorneys don't like delays either. But that's usually the first thing that we see. And then, of course, from there, it can escalate, right? So if we don't have, and by we, I mean the entire team that's involved in the transaction, that includes the borrower, their counsel, the lender counsel, contractor, et cetera. If everybody is not on the same page, not only can it lead to delays, but also could lead to bigger issues. Perhaps we get it further down the road and we find out that the permits, there are some impediments to getting the permits. I'm working on an issue right now where unfortunately insurance is a big issue. And of course, we can't move forward with those types of due diligence hurdles in place. So while it may innocently just kind of result in delays, it could actually manifest into larger issues, which could even prohibit the project from moving forward, which would obviously be the worst case scenario for everybody involved.
Yeah, nobody likes delays. Given these challenges, what legal recourse do lenders have when a construction project goes awry?
Sure. So I think from a lender perspective and certainly from lender counsel perspective, we're always looking at and in the mindset of hoping for the best, planning for the worst. And so, what we see is as the project is getting on track, so to speak, and as we're getting due diligence in, we're taking a look in it to determine what happens if this project fails. What happens if there might be supply chain issues or other issues, maybe outside of the party's control. We have to then be thinking about how can the lender exercise their rights and remedies to maximize their recovery from the project. So that may be something as straightforward as allowing the lender step in and take over management of the project, but it also may result in a need to just liquidate the property. And so we look at it from the legal perspective, not just from a continuance of the project in a construction standpoint, but also potentially foreclosure and resale as well.
That's really important with all the foreclosures that are happening in our current time. Michelle Walters, from your experience, what's a horror story in SBA lending due to poor due diligence?
Yeah, I recently came across a client that secured a $1.5 million loan to renovate an event space. His bank did not use any kind of third-party monitoring, and there was no construction experts within the bank. The lender sent all draws to my client's architect for approval. So the client was really unaware of what was being drawn against his loan. And as the funds began to run out, he started to notice that the amount of funds versus the completion of the project was way off. So unfortunately, he ended up taking $350,000 out of his retirement to finish the construction project just to get it done. Because again, he can't operate his business now because the space isn't done, but he's got to move forward. And so that truly is a true horror story to a lack of monitoring on honestly what should have been a pretty straightforward project.
Yeah, that's such a terrible situation. So, what red flags should lenders look for in construction projects?
Really unrealistic budgets. To piggyback on what Nick said, borrowers who are just kind of unaware of the construction project. Obviously, if you've got contractors that don't want to fill out AIA contracts, that's a big red flag. I mean, we come across these all the time. But basically, anyone who questions kind of the draw process and the monitoring process, I think that's a red flag because those things are there to put in place to protect not only the bank, but the client as well.
Yeah, prevent those horror stories that you talked about. Thanks, Michelle Walters. Michelle Alabiso. Michelle Walters previously mentioned plan, spec, and cost reviews. Could you explain the importance of a PSCR, also known as a plan, spec, and cost review?
Sure, a plan specification and cost review provides the lending institution an analysis of the applicable governing policies and, as applicable, documents potential risk identified as part of the document review process in order to close any loopholes prior to construction. In addition, it will collect information and documents and note what is not available or not completed prior to construction and to limit the lender's risk.
So important. What are some effective solutions for issues typically seen in construction due diligence? Say Michelle Alabiso.
The utilization of industry standard documents, implementing a budget tracking system, incorporating a qualified construction manager, and requiring the use of a lien waiver system will all provide effective solutions for issues typically seen in construction due diligence.
So Nick, what are the legal implications of skipping steps in the due diligence process?
Well, I think a few things. So first of all, just from a prudent lending standpoint, a recovery standpoint, we have to be mindful that when it comes to real estate law and when it comes to, especially as Michelle just mentioned, mechanic lien issues, we have to remember that every state has their own set of mechanic lien laws, right? And so, especially for lenders who, what I call are multi-jurisdictional lending institutions, so they lend in multiple states, it's really important to understand what the applicable laws are in those states. Even with respect to SBA lending, we all kind of think about, well, SBA is a federal lending program, which is absolutely true. However, when it comes to things like real estate law, even though the funds are being provided by a federally regulated program, the applicable laws are at the state level. And so to the point of mechanic lien waivers and the like, we definitely need to understand what the laws are, and then we need to contract around them. And so to the point of having lien waivers, working with other professionals such as title insurers, or construction monitoring firms and management firms is really important to make sure that all of those steps are in place, and then contractually making sure that all of the parties understand what the requirements are for disbursements. So one of the big issues that I see lenders kind of stub their toe on is that they have a contract, i.e. the loan agreement between the lender and the borrower as it relates to the requirements for disbursements. But then there isn't a very robust agreement between the lender, the borrower, the general contractor, and the title company or escrow agent as it relates to the process that's required. We look at that not only from a standpoint of legal protection on the bank side or the lender side as it relates to recovery if the project goes awry, but also we're also discussing SBA. And at the end of the day, we have to be thinking about protecting that SBA guarantee. And really, in those circumstances, in my experience, what the SBA would look at if there were a loss on a construction loan that was funded by an SBA program, the SBA, in determining whether they're going to honor their guarantee, is going to take a look at whether or not the lender acted prudently to protect the interest of the lender in the SBA.
So Nick, just kind of following up on that, if a lending institution isn't really familiar with the laws, what's the best way for them to familiarize themselves? Or is it, if they're really new, reach out to someone like yourself who's an attorney, or someone like, Michelle and LCS that, has been doing this a long time? What do you recommend?
So I always recommend, if a lending institution is not very experienced in construction lending, or maybe they're experienced in construction lending, but just not in the particular jurisdiction or state in which the property is located, before they even go down the path with that borrower of getting the process started, the first thing, in my opinion, they should do is reach out to trusted support, such as either their in-house counsel or external legal counsel, certainly title insurers, as well as construction management firms and monitoring firms such as LCS, to ensure that the lender going in isn't in that same situation that I mentioned earlier with borrowers where they don't know what they don't know, right? So at least if the lender goes in understanding what the requirements are, that lending institution is then going to be able to drive the transaction forward and we'll be able to set the expectations appropriately and the requirements with the borrower and other parties involved.
That makes sense. So, Nick, how often do you encounter legal issues stemming from inadequate due diligence?
On construction loans, I would say only every deal. It really is. It's one of these things where, a lot of borrowers, especially in the SBA lending space, they just are not experienced or sophisticated in construction projects. And quite frankly, there are a lot of lenders and lending institutions who may not they may not do a lot of construction lending. They may do a handful of construction loans a year. And so it's almost like having to learn to ride that bicycle over again each time. And so from our perspective, and it's putting tools in place that can help all the parties involved. I'm a big proponent in utilizing checklists. And checklists are not just task lists for lenders, but it's really a tool that can get the entire team on the same page. So the lender team, the borrower team, the construction team, and the outside vendors and support as well. So everybody understands what their role is. Everybody understands what the requirements and the timing is. And that really helps keep the project on track and also really minimizes the opportunity for things to slip through the cracks.
Yeah, Nick, that's really helpful. And we have some of those checklists that we can circulate if the audience reaches out to help them out. Back to Michelle Walters. Michelle, can you share a specific instance where due diligence could have been prevented or could have prevented a major issue?
I think going back to the client I mentioned earlier with the event space, after completing the project and gathering all the draw documents from the bank and the contractor, my client determined that the bank and the architect authorized drawings for materials that were never used on his project. They were materials for other jobs. Furthermore, his contractor was paid for work that my client believes did not apply to his project. So construction monitoring processes and or firms that monitor, they match these items. They match the work to what's been done. They match the materials to what's on site. I'm going back to what Nick said. This was a borrower that honestly just was not familiar with the construction process. Sadly, he's become an expert today because he's had to do all this research to figure out what went wrong. The monitoring firms verify that the materials and the scope of work being billed are in line with the expectations set out from the beginning. And they ensure that there are adequate funds remaining to complete those processes. No project ever goes exactly as planned. The SBA does require a 10% contingency, which I would love to say I've had clients that have gotten that back post-close, but I don't think that's ever happened. None of us can foresee escalations in, supplies, and steel went up overnight a few years back. Concrete went up overnight a few years back. And so, with the right monitoring and the right processes, when those things happen, you can start to have conversation and make adjustments for projects throughout the remaining construction, just to make sure that you can ultimately finish the project on budget, on time. And again, regarding SBA, because these are owner-occupied properties, these are businesses, these are, facilities to house operating companies that need this cash flow to continue operating. So, having the right process and procedures in place certainly could have helped this gentleman, avoid what he went through with his construction.
Thanks, Michelle. It's good information. Nick, what advice do you have for lenders to stay legally compliant in construction loans?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned before, understanding the laws that are in place in the jurisdiction, understanding what the requirements are of the lending institution internally, and then, as Michelle just mentioned, remembering what the SBA requirements are, but really to avoid those pitfalls, in my opinion, lenders really should utilize experts in the field, and even to the point of utilizing a construction management firm or monitoring firm, not only to help with the due diligence, such as the plans and specs and those kind of straightforward types of things, but also issues such as general contractor background. We've had situations, and I'm working on one right now, where the general contractor that was hired was not vetted by the borrower because they didn't know what they were supposed to be vetting for. And unfortunately, the lender didn't vet for it either. And so here we are now, we are about a third of the way into the project, and it's become readily apparent that the general contractor is in way over their head. And it's causing delays, it's causing cost overruns, it's causing mistakes, and potentially is going to end up causing some issues with respect to zoning and the necessary requirements from the city standpoint, which could ultimately, and very likely, in my opinion, is ultimately going to cost the borrower more money. And it's also going to potentially cause this issue of the project becoming out of balance, where because of the cost overruns, there are not enough loan proceeds that will be available. So now, from a lender's perspective, they're going to have to go in and actively reevaluate the project from a cash flow standpoint. Michelle hit the nail right on the head. That's a bad pun, but hit the nail right on the head with respect to understanding what it's going to look like, even to the point of getting that operating company up and running, and what was the cash flow analysis, what were the projections set for, and what kind of construction timeline were they based on. So all of these things really do go into those issues that can be avoided if lenders and borrowers, for that matter, seek out and utilize expert services in their project.
Yeah, Nick, vetting is so important. We've seen similar situations, but we've also seen where GCs have just stopped working on a job halfway through. So that vetting process is extremely important. Thanks for that information. Michelle Walters, back to you. What are the long-term effects of neglecting proper due diligence?
I think it's just, again, about what Nick said, it's running out of funds before the project is done. I mean, that's bottom line. I mean, one thing is time, but if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. And if you don't monitor as things go along, you can't adjust, you can't switch, you can't change things out. I mean, I have had clients before where we've had to scale a project back just because of unforeseen costs that came up. But again, you find a way to scale a project back and still get the project done in a fashion that can continue for the business owner to allow them to continue operating in their space. But the long-term effects are running out of funds or having a contractor show up saying they didn't get paid. Those lien waivers are really important too. And I would say those are the two big things I see happening when things are done wrong.
Yeah, and you don't want to see either of those. What's the biggest mistake you've seen a lender make in this field? I know you've told us a couple horror stories. But
Yeah. Well, years ago, and this is several years ago, I worked for a lender. It was a small community bank. They did not have any kind of solid construction monitoring processes in place. The bank fully funded the loan. The client did not end up with the completed project. They were only about 60% done. They took the bank to court, and they ended up winning. But I mean, this is a situation that quite honestly nobody wants. The bank didn't want that, and the borrower didn't want that. But it does happen, and it can happen. So lesson learned. And I will say at that point, that's when I decided, oh yeah, we're always going to use third party monitoring when it comes to to deals that I worked on, because I just wanted that insurance that I don't know how to go in and see if the electrical bill has been done, but folks like your team, they do that every day. So
makes sense. Michelle, how do you balance risk and reward in construction lending?
Well, it all starts with proper due diligence, to be honest. I mean, it truly does. Understanding the full potential of the what ifs. No project is going to go as planned. Nick mentioned permitting earlier. I had a client that honestly, it took him over a year to get permit done. I mean, and you reach into a point where you're like, how does that client continue to operate his business? Now they've got loan payments due. We're still waiting on permitting. I mean, it's it's definitely the due diligence in place is definitely there to kind of help the bank and the client mitigate the risks associated with construction.
So, Nick, how do regulations impact the construction due diligence process?
Well, I think certainly we've talked about regulations as it relates to the lending institution and specifically SBA. We have to also be thinking about regulations, and whether they're at the federal level or the state level or the local level, you call it regulations, you call it laws, ordinances, uh, zoning requirements, et cetera. Again, we have to kind of keep our head on a swivel because the requirements and the regulations that apply to the specific project really is going to drive what due diligence not only is prudent, but is what is necessary. And then, of course, we piggyback on that by saying, it's kind of a domino effect, right? Where we first have to understand what the regulatory requirements are. We have to then understand what the due diligence is in order to ensure compliance with those regulatory requirements. And then the last step of it, quite frankly, is to expect the unexpected and put all the safeguards in place. And so the other thing we have to keep in mind, and for those who are not nerdy SBA and lender folks like us, we also have to remember that rules and laws and regulations are constantly changing. I mean, we can look at that from the SBA perspective. 2023 had the most robust rule changes that I can remember in over 20 years in this industry. But we also have every year, if you look at just your home state, you can see when your legislature is in session, you can follow specific laws and proposed rules and lawmaking. And then we have to identify when those laws go into effect. So you may be in a state where some laws go into effect on January 1st. Some laws go into effect on August 1st and anywhere in between. I think from a standpoint of understanding the, kind of changing landscape, if you will, of the regulatory requirements, we have to be thinking about all of these levels of rules and requirements and regulations. Lending institutions should have a good system in place for monitoring all of those changes as they come about.
Thanks, Nick. Michelle Walters, how has the landscape of construction due diligence changed in recent years?
I would say with recent supply chain issues and labor shortages, it's become even more important. I've seen tremendous cost increases in both materials and labor. And then you couple that with supply chain disruptions. All of these result in budgets that are quite frankly blown. So, and time is money. So, with property diligence, lender can maybe pivot quickly to adjust for some of those changes and still get the project done, on time and within budget. But I think that only happens with property diligence at this point.
How does due diligence protect both the lender and the borrower?
Well, there's a strong correlation between proper due diligence and successful projects. Starting out there. Bottom line is knowledge is power. And the more preparation for a project, the better the chance for success. And then the goal is ultimately, again, a complete project on time and budget. And that's the goal for the lender and the client. It's a win-win for both.
So, Michelle Alabiso, can you describe the process of conducting a PSCR, PCR review? And for those who don't know, since we didn't mention already, a PCR is known as a property condition report, or also known as a property condition assessment.
Sure. The review of a third-party PSCR or PCR is a pretty detailed process. First off, we start by thoroughly reviewing all the documents provided. Our main goal is to check the accuracy and quality of information and to really understand the project inside and out. After that, we ensure that what's reported actually lines up with the backup documentation. And then we take a close look at the photographic documentation that's included in the PCR to ensure that it matches with what's being reported. Finally, then we review the costs to make sure they're in line with what's industry standard. It's not just about the numbers being right. It's about ensuring that they make sense in the grand scheme of things.
The review process is a really important step. Make sure that everything's in line. Nick, can you share an experience where legal intervention saved a construction project?
Sure. We're working on one right now where the construction due diligence was, I would say, less than spectacular and less than thorough. Unfortunately, in that instance, the lender did not engage some important support, did not have an experienced construction management team on board. And so once the project started to go down the tracks, we realized that there were some irregularities in the way that the general contractor was conducting the construction, was requesting draws. And at that point, we did get the construction monitoring firm involved, and they were able to assist the lender in identifying the issues. And so fortunately, at the outset, we had set up the documentation to allow the lender in certain circumstances to step in and take over management of the project. And of course, from a lending standpoint, that's kind of the last thing we ever want to have to do. But we were able to detect it early enough on so that the lender was able to get in and get the project back on track. And now, there are some cost overruns. However, what previously looked like a surefire foreclosure, significant loss to the lender, and quite frankly, in my opinion, at that point, I felt like the lender's SBA guarantee was in jeopardy. And by we, I don't just mean our law firm, but collectively, the lender, the construction monitoring and management team, our team from a legal standpoint, have been able to not only get the construction project back on track, but also, in my opinion, has really shored up the SBA guarantee. And so we're able to move forward much more comfortable that not only can we salvage the project and get the borrower's business back on track, but at the end of the day, making sure that we've really mitigated that risk to the lender.
Yeah, it's fantastic that you were able to pull it all together and get the project back on track. And I'm sure the lending institution appreciated all the hard work that was put into that. Michelle Walters, finally, what future changes do you anticipate in construction due diligence?
Well, it's not that I anticipated change, but a continuation and again, that deeper need for proper due diligence. I think property diligence is going to remain a fluid process. It's going to ebb and chain with what's going on, with our economy and with what's going on right now. But with constant changes in construction, banks and lenders need to remain vigilant in performing due diligence, understanding what that means. There's a knowledge that goes along with it, but just it's taking what you've done and realizing that there's a greater need for doing it, not only just doing it, but doing it better.
Thank you, Nick, Michelle Walters, Michelle Alabiso, for sharing your invaluable insights and experiences today. To our listeners, today's discussion underscores the critical importance of thorough due diligence in SBA lending and construction projects. It's clear that understanding the complexities and staying ahead of potential issues can make all the difference in the success of the project. That concludes today's episode. Stay tuned for more insights and discussions on navigating the complexities of construction and also appraisal and environmental due diligence on the Smarter Lending podcast. And stay tuned for our second episode, which will be coming out shortly on the construction and SBA lending. Thank you all.